Hello.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
We're just getting the Facebook feed going.
Okay.
I think that seems to be working. I think that's all good.
Great.
Looks like it. Okay. We have lots of people here.
Super. Very happy. And let's see.
Why, thank you. So this is the book display.
Yes.
Hours it took to do that. Hi, Alisson. How are you?
Good. How are you? I'm so happy to be here.
Great. We are all good, I think. All right. Well, let's get going. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this. This is the 9th installment of Must Read TV, the Skylark Bookshop Virtual Author Series. My name is Alex George, and I'm the owner of Skylark Bookshop, which is an independent bookstore in downtown Columbia, Missouri. I've really been looking forward to this evening's event for a long time. Even if, as we as a society are plagued by new things, so plagues both literal and metaphoric, there are some challenges and iniquities that are as old as human life itself. And this evening, Skylark is proud to present Reclaiming the Narrative, featuring two brilliant authors whose new books interrogate some of those challenges and iniquities to stunning effect. Michelle Bowdler is the author of Is Rape a Crime?, which has been praised by the Boston Globe as an indictment of one of the most glaring contradictions of the US criminal justice system. Michelle is the executive director of health and wellness at Tufts University, and after graduating from the Harvard School of Public Health, has worked on social justice issues related to rape for over a decade. She is a recipient of a 2017 Barbara Deming Memorial Award and has been a fellow at Ragdale and the MacDowell Colony. Michelle's writing has been published in the New York Times, and her essays have been nominated for Pushcart Prizes. Alisson Wood is an award-winning writer whose essays have been published in the New York Times, Catapult, and Epiphany. She holds an MFA in fiction from New York University. Alisson teaches creative writing and is the founder and editor of Pigeon Pages, a New York City literary journal and a reading series. Being Lolita, her first book, has received wide acclaim and is described by Melissa Febos as a chilling and propulsive debut about the danger of being captive inside someone else's story and the power of choosing your own. Michelle and Alisson will be in conversation for about 40 minutes or so. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I will then, technology willing, reappear at some point towards the end of the discussion to moderate the Q&A part of the discussion. This evening is, on a personal note, particularly fun for me because all three of us are in fact published by Flatiron Books, which is an imprint of Macmillan. And so it seems appropriate as stablemates just to give a little shout out to our
Yes.
wonderful publisher. So if anybody's out there watching from Flatiron, hi, thank you. All right. Both Michelle and Alisson's books are, of course, available for sale at Skylark Bookshop. And if you enjoyed this evening's conversation, we'd really be very grateful if you would consider purchasing one or both, probably both, I think, of them from us. All right, that is the housekeeping taken care of. I'm going to see if I can make myself disappear now and leave you both to it. And I'll look forward to seeing you in a little while.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you, Alex. Well, thank you and welcome, everybody. And Alisson and I have done an event before, and we decided that we could interview one another, and we're so grateful to Skylark Books and Alex. And so we're going to begin with Alisson doing a short reading. I wanted to just start, though, by telling you that I am also a reader of Alisson's wonderful memoir, Being Lolita, and I really can't say enough about it. It is beautifully written. It is very beautifully crafted, and everybody, including myself, who, if you look on social media, who are praising the book, continue to say that they couldn't put it down. And that was true for me as well. And it was true for my daughter, who then grabbed it and read it after. So I just wanted to say that and welcome and thank you for having us. And so I'm going to turn it over to Alisson for a read, and then we will have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Oh, you're so kind. I'm trying not to blush. Okay, so I'm just gonna dive right in to Being Lolita. I'm just gonna read 2 very short sections. Being Lolita. The first time he kissed me, it wasn't on the mouth. I hadn't read the book yet. He told me it was a beautiful story about love. We would meet in the next town over, a diner off the highway, open all night. I would know what time to meet him in our booth in the back corner because in the middle of his class, in front of everyone, he would look at me, look into my eyes and write a number on the blackboard, 8 or 9 or 10, and then wipe it away with his other hand. He was an English teacher in my high school. His shirt sleeves were always chalk kissed with white. He was 26. The first time he saw me, I was 17. I would tell my parents I was going to a friend's house or studying somewhere, but really, I would be sitting across from him for hours. The pastel painting depicting Greek ruins on the wall above him, while he would grade his students' essays, and I would sometimes do my Latin conjugations. Mostly, I would write to him, in front of him, and he would bring it home or sometimes read it there under the 24-hour fluorescence and then write back. Oliver napkins, the paper placemats, scraps from school. We probably covered hundreds of pieces with cursive, but I have only the handful that I hid from him, kept close and stolen away. Before we would leave, he'd take the papers and napkins and rip them up, put them into our water glasses, and I would watch them lose their shape and the ink bleed. I wasn't allowed to keep things. I wasn't supposed to call him Mr. when we were alone, only his first name. But I could never call him that in school. No phone calls, no emails, no touching. He made the rules. The rules were broken at that diner in our booth. It was May. Summer was almost there and graduation hung in every classroom, crepe paper and glue glitter banners filling the halls. A countdown everywhere. You couldn't escape it. He was trying to teach me about great literature, to prepare me for what I would face as a freshman in college just a few months in the future. You should definitely be an English major, he told me, leaning back into the booth, his arms stretched out on top of the bench, taking up so much space across from me. It was the pose that, if we were on a date, unseen in a dark theater, would be the transition movement before he put his arm around me. He wouldn't bother with a fake cough, he'd just go for it, I was sure. He would read me the greats at our table of beige formica and dull silver. Poe, Dickens, Hawthorne, Carroll. He'd get into it, doing voices when he read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, laughing at literary jokes that I was surely supposed to understand, so I laughed too. I lapped it up, knowing how lucky I was to have this kind of private instruction. That night, he was reading Lolita to me, from the beginning of things. He spoke to me in Nabokov's opening lines languidly. Light of my life, fire of my loins. I thought it was the most romantic thing ever, but I was ruining it. I had a bug bite and I kept pushing my ankles together, trying to quell the tinge of itch. A child who couldn't sit still. He began rubbing the edges of the pages with his thumb, harder and harder as his voice grew louder, creating tiny rips in the paper as he stroked them. Finally, he asked, "A mosquito bite?" "Yes," I said, an invisible ruler against my spine. "Don't you have any calamine lotion?" "Not on me," I said. "You know," he said, "saliva can stop the itch." He looked at me. He had green eyes. My flip-flopped feet were on the cracked red leather next to him on the booth, my legs under the table, bridging the gap between our bodies, not touching, just beside him. I followed the rules. He leaned down to my foot next to him and put his lips on my pink, swollen ankle. I felt his breath on my skin. And it was like every locker in the halls of my high school swung open at once, metal kissing cinder block walls. It felt just like that. And then I'm gonna jump ahead to another small section, and this is from part 3. So basically all that you need to know is that, sorry about the fire things in the background. Basically all that you need to know is that this is more than 15 years after that experience had ended, and as I'm trying to sort of figure out what had happened to me, and that's all you really need to know. I began to question my memory, my very self. I was surrounded by teenage girls in my job. Oh, I was working, doing domestic violence prevention with teenagers. I was working at a Boys and Girls Club, and that's why I was surrounded by teenagers. I was surrounded by teenage girls in my job, seeing every day how they were decidedly not adults. But my idea of who I was as a teenager was so different. I wanted to see myself clearly. I wanted to find the photograph of me taken that night backstage from the play. The way I felt looking at him, the power of my gaze, how seductive I was trying to be. I remembered the blue and white dress I was rented for my costume, the brown shoes I wore that were my own. I remembered red lipstick. I remembered the lines I had to do on stage that night. I remembered looking right at my teacher when the photo was snapped. After days of prowling through albums and in boxes, it appeared, and it wasn't what I remembered at all. Yes, my mouth was red, my dress was blue and white, my shoes were brown leather. But my expression, there was nothing sexy there, no power at all. I was sitting on a metal folding chair, no one else fully in the frame, my chin up towards something above me, my arms on my lap, and I didn't look like the mature woman I imagined myself to be then. Pretty, yes, but more than anything, I looked sad. Part of me wanted proof that I was asking for it, that I did look like a grown-up, maybe, that I did have some power. Deeply, I wanted to have evidence of my longing, my unmissable lust, evidence that I had agency then, that maybe I really was special and just so sexy that he couldn't say no, that maybe I did seduce him after all. Instead, I was faced with my deepest fear. I looked and looked at her, at myself, at 17. My eyes were big and my face opened, my mouth downturned, tight. I looked as though I could be on the verge of tears. I was a child, and he wasn't. That photograph caught me at one of the moments when I remember feeling the most sexy and seductive for the teacher. And if that was even close to capturing what I really was then, any excuses I try to make for the teacher break and shatter. Look at this tangle of thorns. Thanks.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Those were 2 really powerful pieces, and I have to say that your voice was actually different in each one. You can feel the passage of time in a really visceral way. So thank you for that. And so my question, the question I have for you is, why those pieces? Sort of for tonight, what was that choice about for you?
Well, I think the opening is always fun to read because it very quickly establishes what this book is about, I think. I think people would be sort of hard pressed to listen and not be like, oh, that's what this book is about. Got it. It establishes a lot of things really quickly. Who I was, who the teacher was. You sort of get an idea of both the tension and the sort of like, feeling of power and sexy, but also I think the danger there and the fact that it's a secret. I think it really sets up a lot. And the part about the second section I read, the part about the photograph was just, I've been thinking a lot about lately about how I'm being how I'm being perceived now, and how I as a grown-up, I as an author, I as a 36-year-old woman who's written this book and published this book. And I'm very lucky in that even in all the any criticism that I've gotten, it's never been suggested to me that what I wrote about wasn't true. It's interesting. Nobody has questioned what happened, which I was sort of not expecting. I'd sort of prepared myself to like be told like, oh, this didn't happen, you're making it up. No one said that to me, which is interesting. Good. It's very good. But it's interesting. And I wonder if part of that is maybe post Me Too. It's not as comfortable for people to call someone a liar. Do you know what I mean? But nonetheless, I do sometimes still get pushback about, well, how much were you doing? You know, what was your role, and so on. And so I was really thinking a lot about who I was at 17. And I tried to capture that in describing the picture. And I actually so behind me, I have this little like bulletin board that has like all sorts of stuff. It has a picture of my car when I was 17. It has like some butterfly stuff. It has the stamps. It has all sorts of things from the book and things that I was just sort of using to like help me get there. Did you do something like that with your book? Like create some sort of like memory board or something?
I do have stacks of archive reports from the Boston Globe. So I do have that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have a box of papers and journals and all that stuff too. But I made something visual.
Yeah,
and
I liked it.
I found it helpful, you know.
Yeah.
And one of the things I took down was that picture that I talk about. And like, let me see if, so this is the picture of me.
Yeah.
And
You
like,
do look sad.
I look really sad.
Yeah.
And I look really young, because I was. I mean, I was at this point, I was 17 when this was taken, sorry. And yeah, I look sad and small, and, you know, it's just sort of, and the funny thing is like, and I write about, and I say this, but in my mind, I remembered when this had happened, and I thought I was like, look at me, like doing my sexy pout, and like, you know, it was just such an intense experience that I remembered so vividly. But then when I had to face the photo, like the actual reality, I was like, oh, that's not what was actually happening at all.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the tough jobs of writing a memoir. You have to face the facts of things, not always what you remember, which maybe is more comfortable or, you know, easier or something. So yeah, I was thinking a lot about that these past couple of days. So that was why I chose to read those two.
Yeah, I'm really glad you did. And so the title of this talk is Reclaiming the Narrative, and I do love that title, and I wanted to ask you specifically what that means for you and for the writing of your book. Sort of what feels essential in that topic.
Yeah, I love reclaiming the narrative, like as our theme for tonight, but also just that very idea. And I feel like that's so much what both of our books are doing. We are reclaiming this narrative. We are taking the story that is told about us, and us as specific individuals, but also us as women, as victims, as survivors, as, you know, all of that. And I feel like both of us are really working really hard to take that back. And in my book, I mean, not only was I trying to do that on a personal level to really push hard into myself about what happened to me, what was this relationship. You know, he was significantly older. He was a teacher in my high school. I was 17, you know, I mean, and it quickly escalated from after school tutoring to meeting in secret at the diner and all of these things, and became very, very sexual and abusive and manipulative. And then when we finally did sort of have a relationship, it was incredibly abusive and awful very, very quickly. And he loved the book Lolita. He loved Lolita. And he told me it was a beautiful story about love. And I believed him. And I thought that our story was a love story and that I was so lucky. And now as an adult, it's very clear that, oh, that's not what was actually happening at all. So I really tried to both lean into the fact that I was an unreliable narrator at 17 and 18 of my own life, but then also reclaim the actual story of what happened to me. And I feel like these are stories that are told, you know, there's Lolita. I feel like there's all the, just as a one obvious literary example, but I feel like there are so many stories told about, you know, older woman, younger girl, and also stories about sexual assault and rape and how we talk about that. And I really wanted to subvert those expectations and push against the stories that we know. And also there's such power in who gets to tell those stories. So I thought it was especially important for me to tell my story and for me to try to set an example for other women to also tell their stories, because that's such important work to do right now. I'm sure you feel the same way from your book.
I do. No, I really do. And a lot of what you're talking about really resonates with me. And I also think that the image of the way you use the book, Lolita, and, you know, again, people will read the book, but the way that you use the book and the teacher's interest in the book and what, you know, I have to say that book is such a famous book, and it is one of the most widely misunderstood books in the world. You know, people still talk about it as a romance when it's anything but. And I really appreciated that you really deconstructed both what people think it means and what it actually means. And I thought that was very, very powerful. And so speaking of that, I'm going to ask you about the cover of your book.
Ooh, yes.
Because, you know, I don't know that and I don't know that people can really see that the glasses are broken and one of the frames is off. And and for those of you who may not be sort of old movie buffs, that image of the sunglasses, of the heart sunglasses, was made famous in a poster in a the original Stanley Kubrick. I think that was even a remake, but in 1962. And that Lolita character was made out to somehow be also, you know, portrayed in a way that was somebody else's image of her. And so I was going to ask you about the choice of that cover and also how you may have reclaimed that image for yourself as well.
Yeah, I mean, the cover image is really interesting. So there are no heart-shaped glasses in the original Lolita, like in the novel.
Nope.
Never mentioned. It is when he first sees Dolores hates her actual name. When he first sees Dolores, it's my Riviera love peering over dark rimmed glasses or something like that. But they're not heart-shaped glasses.
No.
In the Kubrick film, there are no heart-shaped glasses.
No.
But somehow in the cover, in the movie poster for the Kubrick version, in the movie poster, which is of course what we all think of, it's Sue Lyons, you know, little blonde with the heart-shaped glasses sucking a lollipop. And that's the image that we think of when we think of Lolita. And that was, of course, reproduced on many copies of the book and blah, blah, blah. I actually have a book. It's a little too far for me to grab, but that's called Lolita, a Cover Girl. And it's just about like different images of Lolita from the book, from the movies. It's fascinating. And I think that really is reflective about how you were saying how we misread Lolita. We think of Lolita in our popular culture as this sex pot, this Jezebel, this seductress. But in actuality, in the book, it's the story about a pedophile who kidnaps and rapes this young girl. I mean, there's nothing romantic about that. Yet still one of the original pull quotes from the first Vanity Fair review of it called it the most convincing love story of our century. Which is just, it's just so disturbing to me. Um, so I think that in a lot of ways, even just the book cover was a way to subvert and reclaim the narrative of this story, because by taking this iconic object that people think of Lolita, and even if you don't know the book Lolita, even if you don't know the exact reference, you still see these heart-shaped glasses, and it's like, oh, romance, sexy, these sunglasses are for a girl, you know, like they're for a young girl. Like there's a lot of power just in the image, in the object of ourselves, because of course all objects are neutral until we make them, until we endue meaning what's the word? Place meaning on them. Right. But I really wanted to use the glasses and show them a little bit broken and smashed, and the one arm is taken off, and the, you know, because my story and Lolita and all of these stories are not love stories. No. These are not these romantic, sexy experiences. They're damaging. That's right. And they're traumatizing, and they are awful. But also, if I am the glasses, I am not fully broken. I'm just a little. That's right. Because there was discussion about like how broken should the glasses be. That was a long discussion, many emails about how broken should the glasses be, and it's like, well, Allison's not broken, so we don't want to make him shatter, just a little dinged up.
Fascinating. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, covers are really interesting, you know, the visual, it's so important. Even though these are, you know, written, it's still the visual medium matters a lot. So, yeah.
and you know, I want to add, and I have many more questions for you, but I want to add that those choices about how the book is going to be represented are really important. What the title choice finally is, or what the you know, what the book actually looks like. And I know for me, they asked me if I had any preferences, and mostly I knew what I didn't want. So I was like, no crime scene tape, no flowers, and no police cars, and no justice, you know, the whatever that woman is with the justice, her. I'm like, I don't want that. So that's why there's no images. So
no, I mean, I remember oftentimes with publishers, they'll give you, I'm sure you got this because we're both a Flatiron, the same questionnaire. Not only did I fill out the questionnaire, but I also sent in a 28-page PowerPoint
Good for you.
with examples of things that I liked, things that I hated, examples of like possible iconography. Like, I mean, I had a whole section of like, okay, you want to do sexy? This is sexy, I think is cool, like the cover of Tampa, or, you know, things like that. And it was like, this is not the kind of sexy I want. And like, I had good Lolita and bad Lolita covers. And I mean, because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of Lolita covers, especially internationally. And some of them are just like, whoa, some of them are deeply disturbing. So because it matters. It's important.
And the intentionality is impressive. I appreciate hearing that, you know, it's not an accident, and it represents you in many, many ways. So it's important that it's done right.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So one of the questions I have, and I think, you know, other people may have as well, is, you know, people keep talking about, or at least mentioning to us, what a strange time this is to launch a book. And I'm wondering if you've been asked how this has been for you. Have you had responses, for example, from family and friends that have, you know, helped support you during this time, and sort of what that's been like for you? And is there anything that's been surprising to launch a book, you know, from your living room or from your office? And if you just want to talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I've been so lucky in that I have an incredibly, wonderfully close-knit group of friends and family and writing friends, and just I have this wonderful community around me that has been supporting me and uplifting me and encouraging me on this book for years. I mean, I'm sure it was just, I did not write this book overnight. This book took a long time. So there were people in my corner supporting me for a long time, luckily. And I've just been overwhelmed by how much love and encouragement I've gotten. And I think probably the most surprising thing is, and this is also honestly maybe the best thing about this book, is that I hear from readers almost every day. And
yeah,
it's so wonderful. It's so, because the readers are almost entirely women. And they, everyone is just so kind. And I get these lovely messages from, mostly from women. I've only gotten a couple messages from guys, mostly from ladies, talking about how much, sometimes it's just, I love this book, congratulations. Sometimes it's, I love this book, this meant so much to me. I feel understood. I wish I had this book when I was 17, like I do. And it's just so impactful to hear these women talking about how this story of being taken advantage of being groomed by a predator when you were a student and the predator was a teacher, how common it is, and how important it's for women and all victims to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be heard, and just to know that I am making someone feel like I so desperately wished I could have felt at that age is just overwhelming. And it's truly the best part. So what's it been like for you?
It's very similar in that I'm starting to hear from people and it's very humbling. And if you ask me why I wrote the book, it was very important for me to feel like the ways in which I felt like what happened to me, that it was invisible, or that it didn't matter in some way, is that the book itself, I hope, will amplify how untrue that is, and that there are people out there that, that do see what people who've been through this go through. So it has been wonderful. And so I'm gonna be our timekeeper.
I was about to mosey on over to,
excellent.
I think that's actually one of my favorite things about your book, is that I think that as someone who has also been raped, not different than in the book, I think it's such a common experience. Like, let's just be real. Like, sexual assault and rape and sexual violence and domestic violence, it's wildly common. It's not talked about very much, though, or it's getting more talked about, but still not enough. And so many people I know haven't gone through the legal system part of it because there's so much shame. And also we get very clear messages that, okay, what's the point? You're not going to get justice. It's just going to be this awful long-term experience, which, I went through 2 years of court from when my boss at work raped me, and it was terrible. So you are the third person I know who has done that process. And something I love about Is Rape a Crime is that you don't shy away from how tough it was. And it's so illuminating. And also, it's just this book is so smart, and it's so thoughtful and insightful. And there's so much about your book that I love. And I wish my book was more like yours sometimes, because it's just so, I'm not being anywhere near.
You're fine.
I'm sort of mumbling at this point, but it's because I love your book so much, and it's just so good. So would you read a bit for us?
I will, and thank you for saying that. And I realized that I almost never read the beginning, because the beginning is really very research-based and intellectual. But in fact, I think it really does set the stage for the memoir piece that's to come. So I'm just going to read a piece, and it also begins to answer the question about why the title. So I'm gonna go right for that and just read for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'll just stop and say, okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
So here we go. And I'll try to have it here so that my face isn't all the way down. Is rape a crime? It's a startling question. Most people would answer emphatically, of course it is. They might even add, what kind of a question is that? The question, though, is a fair one to explore, given how rape is treated in our country and around the world, under-investigated, trivialized, and excused. Is anything else enacted as an international weapon of war and referred to for a sure laugh at a comedy club? Raping in the United States is a felony in theory, but evidence of rape is largely ignored, and victims are expected to prove their veracity. This reluctance from law enforcement to use its valuable resources does not seem to extend to other felonies, the kind where evidence is tested and witnesses interviewed, the kind DAs prosecute readily, the kind where arrest and conviction are more than a remote possibility. We're left with a central contradiction here. Most people, when asked, would agree that rape is one of the most horrific violations that can happen to a human being. Yet somehow, society appears to stand aside while crimes of rape are minimized or dismissed, if they are reported at all, if they're investigated at all. The crime of rape sizzles like a lightning strike. It pounces, flattens, and devastates its victims. A person stands whole, and in a moment of unexpected violence, that life, that body is gone. If the eviscerated individual somehow rises, incredulous bystanders shout with relief, they're alive, they're a survivor, not realizing the victim's organs are incinerated, her brain runny scrambled egg. And what of those internal scars? Does time alone allow regeneration? Can medical care fully repair the bodily damage the lightning bolt so violently imprinted? Since the injuries are largely unseen by others, how does the victim carry on? How are the scars attended to and softened rather than made hard and immovable? To answer these questions, to really answer them and not turn away, we need to consider the role we play in dismissing the experiences of victims of sexual violence. This collusion by omission occurs in large measure to protect our own vulnerability. The challenge of confronting a power structure so entrenched that its full impact is unseen lies in the insidiousness of our need to look away. What we accept as a normal response to sexual violence is anything but. We must make space for each individual story, creating a larger mosaic of what has emerged as an all too common experience, the delegitimization of rape as a crime. Only then can we begin to change how it is addressed in our society. This is a difficult task I ask of you, to look at these violent crimes full on and listen as I tell my story and what it implies about a collective disregard for victims of sex crimes. But I hope you will listen, and I hope you will consider engaging in a shared and urgent task to both recognize and raise awareness about the many ways rape is treated differently from all other felonies and to demand change. Our collective efforts are needed in this essential task, and the work cannot be done in isolation.
Oh, thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you so much. Something that's, so I know we've got a couple questions, but I wanted for us to chat just a little bit first. Something that I think is so interesting about both of our books is I feel like in so many ways they are about the same subject, but we open our books so differently. Yeah. You know, with mine, it's sort of like going right into the moment and the scene, and yours is this beautiful, intellectual, thoughtful essay, sort of provoking these questions and really sort of like going for the jugular about what is happening in our world that we let this happen. So I wanted to know, what made you sort of make that choice? Was it a conscious choice? Was it something that your editor suggested? Was it somewhere else in the book and you moved it?
It was brand new, and I think that's a great question. The book was originally, and I shouldn't say just a memoir, but it was a memoir. It was, this is a story about someone who had this devastating home invasion that finds out later that the Boston Sexual Assault Unit was begun in response to this spate of crimes in the city, and then 30 years later decides to go back and find out what happened in her case. And what somebody I'm very close to is taking a course right now called Making the Personal Universal. And both when this book was being bought, both people who were interested, both houses, asked if I would be willing to do some research to really look at how my story is, like you said, and in the book at the very end I say it's unbearably common.
Unbearable.
But it doesn't feel that way. And so in writing the introduction, it was one of those things that just kind of like came out of me. And I was surprised at how easy it was to write. And usually I feel like writing is so
hard.
You have to write, yes, hard. It's really hard. And this must have been something that was living inside of me, because it really came out, especially because we had decided that this was going to be the title. And I really wanted to take it head on to say, there's a very real reason I have that question.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, you talk about it in your intro, but then also towards the end of the book, I love that you come back to the question, you know, can we really say that rape is a crime given the way this felony is addressed by law enforcement, politicians, the larger world? For many intractable social and political issues, progress gets measured by whether things are slightly less bad than they once were. Unfortunately, sex crimes are still placed in that category, slightly less bad.
Right.
And it's just, so can you talk a little bit about your title, and then we can move on over to questions from the audience?
Yes, so the title, also in the book, I do mention it in this manifesto, but in the book, I get involved in some national activism work. And initially, and you know, because I was so outraged about the untested rape kits that were in warehouses, right? It was, you know, hundreds of thousands of rape kits. But what I found as I got more and more involved in the advocacy work is that I experienced it as less and less rewarding. And I felt like if we just keep being asked to tell our stories by nonprofits, like, listen to these stories and then we're going to tell you what our organization is doing to make change, but really that the voices of the people who had been through what we have been through in some ways felt silenced. And so in one event, a woman who had been a victim of a serial rapist in her town, in her city, and then found out that her city had 12,000, you know, backlogged, or we're just going to call them uninvestigated rape cases. And had they been treating it like felony.
Abandoned women, abandoned victims.
Exactly. And so she looked at me and literally said, you know, you have to ask yourself if rape is actually considered a crime. And I remember the question just taking my breath away. And when I repeated it in the book, and both the agent and publisher read it, and they said, you know, that should be the title of the book. Like, that is a stunning, shocking question, but it's not cheeky, it's not a joke, and it's not trying to be clever. It's a legitimate question. So.
I completely agree. And I also love how it's, you know, it's a memoir, an investigation, and a manifesto. It's all, because it's all of these things. And I'm so happy that, you know, Flatiron encouraged you to do all this research, because I think it's just so wonderful and necessary and needed in here. And I think it's just so, and also when you were talking about, you know, I did domestic violence work for a long time. Yeah. And I have both been the person who has organized speakers to come in and speak, and I've also been the speaker. Mm-hmm. And I think what you were saying is absolutely right. And it sort of does sometimes feel like, well, what's really, again, what you were saying at the end, like, is it slightly better? Why is that
Yeah,
enough? Why is that
right.
enough for us? And I think in the same way, and how so much of your, not so much, but your book talks about the backlog, the abandoned
Right.
victims. And I think it's so similar to, now we're talking more nationally about the issues of priests in the Catholic Church and that sort of long covered up sexual abuse and rape. And, something that's incredibly disturbing is how many of the messages I get from readers are saying this same thing happened to me. I
Oh,
was
yeah.
abused
Oh,
by a
yeah.
teacher.
Hmm.
When I was working on this book, like in workshops, other MFA students, other writers
Yep.
women would come with me. I had a very similar experience. When I teach, every single semester, there's at least one
Right.
undergraduate girl who's had a similar experience. And I feel like it's so much of the same thing. You just don't want to acknowledge. You just don't want to look,
Right.
like with schools, it's, nobody wants to fire the teacher with, these sorts of allegations who, has this happening because they don't want the scandal. They don't want it on their record. They don't want to be held accountable. So it's that same sort of pass the trash. Let's just ignore this. Let's just let it go away. And I just think that's so frustrating that that's how we treat
Yeah.
these issues.
It's very frustrating. And what's also true, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, is how as soon as there's progress, there's immediate pushback of, okay, enough, or there's, every everyone is afraid. There was some research about how in Forbes magazine they were saying people are afraid to hire women because they're going to be accused of something, as opposed to taking responsibility for why you know
Yeah.
why we ignore abuse and violence against women. And actually, one of the questions I was going to ask you, I'm going to answer my own question, which is, what are you working on now? And I'm trying to write an essay right now about why, like, okay, violence is against the law, right?
Yeah.
Violence, right? So then we create this Violence Against Women Act, and like in the 1990s, because violence really wasn't addressed when it was violence towards women, and domestic violence and
Violence.
sexual abuse and
Spousal rape.
yeah, right. Right. And so, but we needed this special law because it wasn't being addressed. And we also need special victims units because, we can't seem to actually deal with sex crimes unless we have special victims units, which, by the way, don't really work. And they don't do a good job. I don't even really know what's special about them. What's special about them is that they don't really do a very good job solving crimes, as much as, Law and Order SVU would have you believe.
I know.
It's all solved in an hour every time. So
I have that exact same frustration. And I'm working, so I think I'm also sort of trying to go at the same issue that I talk about in my book, but sort of in a different way. I think it's always interesting what authors are sort of working on right after publication, sort of like
yeah.
how different writers' minds sort of work. I've been thinking a lot about what I didn't include in the book. And, believe it or not, I actually did my very best in this to make the teacher, my abuser, look as good as possible. I really did. Like, I went out of my way to be not just fair, but to be kind and to be forgiving and to sort of only tell the nice parts in some ways. Like, I really feel like I went out of my way to paint him in as good of a light as I possibly could without, not telling the story, which is super fucked up. And I've been thinking a lot about how frustrated I am at myself in some ways, that I felt this need to almost protect him in that way, that I felt this need to, care for him. And now that the book is, out and people are reading it and talking to me about it, part of me wishes I was harder on him in some ways. And, maybe this is just sort of me continuing to process, because I don't know about you, but what happened to us is something we will always be processing, that will always be with us. I don't believe in writing as catharsis. This is just going to be things that we are dealing with for the rest of our lives. And part of me wonders, because I feel like I was so in this book, I deal with some incredibly, incredibly shameful, very brutal, embodied experiences, like just very embarrassing things that happened to me, and like that were sexually humiliating and all of these things. And yet I made an effort to not put in anything that he would find embarrassing or that felt petty. And I didn't want to be petty. I wanted to, Michelle Obama, they go low, we go high. I wanted to go high. But now part of me mad. I'm like, why wasn't I petty at times? Like, I should have talked about some of these.
Well, just okay. You're absolutely entitled to that feeling. As a reader, I will tell you that by holding back, we experience that. We're plenty mad, and I think that's actually the best kind of writing, where I took a lot of things out about people as well that didn't need to be in there, and not the main, not a major focus of the book, but nonetheless, in retrospect, I'm glad I did, because I was really nice to that cop who really was like a big buffoon.
But he was first.
Yeah. I mean, but so I think that just I understand, like, but as a reader, I was able to be plenty horrified at his behavior. And but you're right. I mean, I think we'll always wonder about, oh yeah, that sentence got taken out, and this is a major, this is a major piece of sort of how we decide how we want to portray people, because even though it's memoir, it's creative nonfiction as well, and there are things that get put in and things that get left out. So I just want to say it's about 10 of, I think, Alex, we're going to welcome Alex back. And he's going to pop in, and if people do have questions, please put them in the Q&A now, and we can answer a few, or we can have a conversation with Alex, whatever you prefer.
Yeah,
I just want to add quickly, Michelle, thank you for talking me down from my frustration. And I think it's just a week of me just being frustrated about things, and I'm like, well, why wasn't I more petty? But I won't write that essay, don't worry. Sorry, everyone.
You can. You can.
I'd read that essay for sure.
I would too.
Sorry.
We do have some questions. Alison, this one is for you. This is from Tara. I'm just going to read it out rather than try and paraphrase it. Alison writes a bit in the book about the adults who didn't notice what was going on and maybe should have. How did she decide how much to include about, say, her parents? And have they read the book?
Yes. That's a great example of a very conscious decision about what to include, what to not include. I'm a big believer, and it's funny that I'm struggling with my amount of pettiness in the book, because I always tell my students, focus on yourself. You need to be harder on yourself than anyone else in the book. That's your job, not to blame people, not to make assumptions, because, you have no idea of actually knowing what someone was thinking, what someone did or didn't know. We can't get into other people's heads. It's memoir, not fiction. So I really made the choice to focus the book on my experience, and to, with only very few exceptions, to really focus on what this was like for me. And so, part 1 and part 2 are Alisson at 17 and 18, just sort of going in there. And that was, I really wanted my reader to not just understand, but to try to like embody, like to feel what it was like. So that was a choice that didn't allow me to get into sort of to really think too much about other people. But also I didn't want to talk about my parents too much. I didn't want to blame people because I didn't feel like that was fair. I'm talking about my experience and what I did. And so I don't think blame is helpful. I've also been in a lot of therapy. So again, like, I don't think blame is helpful for like a personal way. But, you know, I think again, sort of like what I was just saying, I had this protective urge. And that in some ways also what I'm talking about, sort of like with the pettiness, I'm like, I should have been a lot harder on the administrators, the other teachers who clearly saw things that were happening. And no one said or did anything. And looking back, especially now that I'm a teacher, and I mean, when I stepped into a classroom for the first time, like teaching undergrads, many of whom I teach an intro class, intro to creative writing. So a lot of them are 18, 19, 20, they're little, you know, and for anyone to go into a classroom, especially of high school students, and to feel any urge other than to protect, to support, to uplift, to encourage is monstrous, in my opinion. I think teaching is sacred. And like, I got so angry about what happened to me in a way that I simply had not been before I started teaching. And I think that's also part of what I wonder, like, should I have been tougher on people about their accountability or their lack thereof? But, you know, those were the choices I made in the book, and I stand by my choices. And it's just, again, sort of the thing of constantly processing, you know? And no, my parents have not read the book. My dad, it's so funny you say that. So my dad wants me to like edit the book. So, because I don't want him to read any of like the really awful sexy parts. Well, not sexy, rape parts. So I actually just did this. I X-Acto knifed out many chapters. And you can see, so it's about a third of the book that would get removed. So I'm like, I don't know if this is going to work. So Dad, if you're watching, I don't know if you're going to get to read the book at all, because I think there could be some continuity errors that you might not be able to figure out. And as for my mom, she explained it to me. So apparently, Dakota Johnson's mother is Goldie Hawn, I believe, right? No, Melanie Griffith. So Dakota Johnson is the one who did all those 50 Shades movies. So apparently at one point there was some like red carpet and Melanie Griffith and Dakota Johnson was there. And some paparazzi went up to Melanie Griffith and was like, so what do you think of your daughter in all these movies? And she was like, I'm never going to watch these. Never have, never will. But I am here on this red carpet supporting my daughter and supporting everything that she's doing. I'm just not going to watch this film. And that, my mother gave me that example. She was like, that's how I feel, Allie. I'm not going to read it. And also, I mean, I dedicated the book to her. You know, my mother who, sorry, here's my cat, Nora, who says she will never read this book. And I don't think she's ever going to read the book. But I'd be fine if she did. So, yeah.
Question for you, Michelle. This is from Marsha. Since your story is focused on rape kits, which I assume are only used when a woman is raped, although that may be a false assumption, I'm curious why you chose to use people rather than women when talking about those who were raped.
Right. So I think that's a very fair question. And actually, there's some pretty sad news about sort of the victim demographics of people who've been sexually assaulted. In fact, I think that unfortunately, there are 30% of people who are sexually assaulted before the age of 16, many of whom are, and I'm going to say boys and girls, although, you know, I want to acknowledge that that there isn't just a gender binary, and that it's important that we say that. And actually, a rape kit can be done on men and male identified people as well, because gay men and actually at higher risk of being victimized. Trans men have higher rates of sexual assault than straight men, and it is something that can be done on any gender, and in fact it's a pretty complicated issue about whether people want to endure such a traumatic and invasive exam. It's really hard to talk about, but I think we need to, when somebody is underage, they have to still have some agency to be listened to about what they want and don't want. And we know that going through the criminal justice system is often, for many of us, regardless of whether we're talking about this issue, can be additionally traumatizing. And it's not something a lot of people in our society feel safe doing for very, very good reasons. And so it's not something we should assume people should do or will then go forward with, and we should respect those choices.
Right. Okay, thank you. Well, we're right at 8 o'clock. I have just one question that I want to ask both of you, because I was just looking, and I'm always interested in these things. I wanted to ask you both if you could just respond quickly about the epigrams that you chose. So, Alisson, you had Margaret Atwood, and I know that Kerry, my business partner here, has this on a T-shirt. A word after a word after a word is power, which is a wonderful quote. And Michelle, you chose, well, you had two, but Emily Dickinson, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. And I wonder if you could each both just very briefly talk about why you chose those two beautiful pieces of writing.
Yeah, I'll go first. I chose a word after a word after a word is power because it's from one of my favorite Margaret Atwood poems called Spelling, which is so much about the power of names and naming things and who gets to name things, as my cat Nora agrees. And I think it's also very much about reclaiming power that anyone can have by telling their stories. And I also deeply believe that the personal is political. I deeply, deeply believe that. So I believe that by telling my story, even though it is a personal story, it is also a political act. And this is something that anyone can do. You know, my story is not special. My story is not unique. And by writing it down, I am trying to not just empower myself, but also to empower and acknowledge and create space for others. So yeah, I mean, and also I love Margaret Atwood, and I think she's such a badass.
She's a badass.
Her poetry is so great. People don't think of her poetry, but her poetry is so good. I mean, you fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
I actually didn't know she, yeah.
Yeah. So good.
Yeah.
So good.
She's so good.
Yeah.
Okay, so hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. People have said to me about this book, they were afraid to read it, or they're intimidated, or they think it's going to be scary, or that it's going to be too serious. But you know, what's inside of this book is a lot about love, a lot about optimism, a lot about joy that has been true in my life. And I needed people to know that right from the very beginning, that we're all human, we all have our experiences. I had to make meaning out of an experience that was so overwhelming that it, you know, flooded me in waves over many, many years. But inside of that story is a love story between me and my wife, about raising incredible children, about finding my way with my education, and having friends today that I had when I was 24 years old when this happened, who are as dear to me now and more so than they were then. And so the concept of hope I wanted right in the beginning of the book. So
Perfect.
thank you for noticing that.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. And I also just want to say, I think that also builds upon this idea that we're not defined by this. While this was, of course, these experiences are, of course, incredibly impactful and echo and, you know, stay with us in different ways. This doesn't define who we are. And it doesn't mean we cannot be full of happiness or joy or any of those wonderful things too, and power and hope. So I love that you used Emily Dickinson.
Thank you.
Well, that's a nice note to end on. And I'm just going to read to you, excuse me, a comment that just popped in by an anonymous attendee. This seemed like a good way to end. Such strong, beautiful women. And then the question, will this call recording be posted somewhere for later watching? And the answer is yes, it will be on YouTube. We'll be uploading it to the Skylark YouTube channel. So on that note, I'm going to offer my deepest and most profound thanks to Michelle. She is, oh, she's a pro. Mind you, by the way, that whole 28-page PowerPoint thing, Alison, you're just like putting the rest of us to shame.
I had very strong feelings about the cover, and I was very afraid. I was deeply afraid of what the cover could be. With a title like Being Lolita, I was like, oh God, like, oh, That was
great.
I had strong feelings.
Thank you both so much. We love doing these online events, but in order to continue putting them on, we really do need your support. So please do buy Michelle's book and buy Alison's book from us. You can drop us a line at mail@skylarkbookshop.com or give us a call, 573-777-6990. Next week, I will be talking with Mamta Chowdhury about all things Parisian as we discuss her novel, Haunting Paris. Michelle, Alison, thank you both so much for what was such a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you all at home for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.